Okay, here we go. Good morning, everybody. Today is February 24th, 2021. This is the SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting. We have one topic in the agenda today, and we are going to jump into it. I will be taking notes, which is something that we don't usually do very well. So I will volunteer for that today. And let's take it off. Who would like to start?
Yeah, I can start.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for your time. So there was many discussions in the past about a bad admission webhook could intercept all users' requests, and including control manager and scheduler lease renew requests, so that we're made control manager or scheduler in a bad state. So there was no concrete design or mechanism to prevent from this happening. So I submit a proposal where, just to simply put, operator can use flags in API server as kind of providing a client-side override of those fair close policy, or you can expand this to be like API based. So if you think of the admission webhook as a server, API server as a client, so we can expose API to apply client-side override for those failure policy and timeout policies. So I know Daniel made some comments that he doesn't really want operator to know about everything about what the critical resources in the cluster. So I'm like seeking advice from the community on the path forward.
This has actually come up before. I don't know if Daniel linked to. He did link to it. When we spoke about it before, there was a lot of discussion of, depending on precisely how you're deployed, there can be many different things that become critical. And then there are like critical, and then kind of critical stuff. Did you listen to the recording?
Yeah, I watched it twice.
Okay, great. So
then you know more than we do right now.
Yeah, because I'm trying to remember it, but I remember part of the problem being trying to find a way to figure out what persona, which person should have control of this configuration. And do you have a recommendation? So I guess I can start with I'm not for having a flag like this cat proposes.
And yeah, I think if you have this problem, you don't want to restart API server to change it. So I think we can't do that.
Yeah. But I'm interested in like how you would try to divide up those actors, and right, like a config file on disk faces a similar problem, right, where only a cluster admin can touch it, and not even necessarily that in some cloud environments, right?
Yeah, I actually have a even more abstract point, which is there's kind of an arms race between policy, like people who want to add policy, who want to make the cluster secure, and people who want to add reliability to make sure it's always running. And I don't think we should approach those problems in isolation. Otherwise, we're like an arms dealer, right? We sold admission webhooks to the security people, and now we're going to sell like a way to ignore admission webhooks to the cluster operator. And I don't think we want to just keep giving it. What are we going to do next? We're going to give admission webhooks a way to like, no, really ignore the cluster operator. This is really important. It's more important to break the cluster, right? Like we don't want to ever escalating series of no, really ignore what the other guy said command. So I think there needs to be some. I have no idea how to do it, but I think whatever we do here needs to be holistic. and right. So we just, I mean, I guess it's better to be an arms dealer than it is to be on one of the sides, but ideally there's not an arms race at all.
So, I don't think I've devoted as much thought to this probably as you have, Michael, but like, have you tried to like formulate who would have the knowledge, who should have the power, and some sort of principle you go on? Basically, I'm not sold on it right now. I think there is maybe some kind of path forward to, if we can find a way to crisply describe those. I don't know what it is though, which makes it hard for me to come up with something really concrete.
Yeah, I agree that figuring out who is, like, what's the role of the person who cares about the cluster reliability, that sounds super useful. I think there's another definition that could be useful, which is like, what's the, how do you programmatically detect what is a problematic rejection, webhook rejection, right? Like, because I think whoever is responsible for keeping the cluster reliable, I think it is pretty reactive for them to like wait for an outage and then like have to go change a config file or do something like that. So I think it would be super helpful if we could write down exactly what it is we're defending against, so I'm sure that we cannot actually just write that down because it's kind of an unbounded set. There's a lot of complicated, like you mentioned, leases, which are a easy example of what can break your cluster, and just promising that all leases go through, I guess, is one way. But there's I can imagine lots of like ways where there's like reentrant webhooks, and like I do a deployment and then that webhook intercepts that and does something else, and then that webhook triggered on that does something else, and then somehow that's relying on the deployment that's running, and right, like I can really imagine so many complicated ways for there to be a cycle, and a very surprising webhook rejection breaks the cluster. So I think what I'm looking for is like a like general way of knowing. Yeah, it sounds very hard, but I think actually if we could write down what it is we're defending from, like defining that is so hard that I think if we could just write that down, we would have at least half of the solution.
Yeah, so from my original perspective, I was trying to defend against, I was trying to defend controller manager and kube scheduler in particular as a cluster administrator or like managed Kubernetes service, because the service is responsible for those control plane components, while customer are managing like worker nodes. So I try to make that separation.
Yeah, but imagine imagine a customer runs their own scheduler, which is something you can do, and it's got to keep its own lease, which is very reasonable for it. Then if you've got access to these flags or whatever and the customer doesn't, then they can't use that same mechanism to protect their own system, which is going to be just as critical to their workloads as the default scheduler. So
yeah, you can also see, like, I'm looking at the list that Martin linked to in the chat, and there's some stuff in here that's really opinionated that like I would look at and say, you know what, I think it's pretty fair to have an admission webhook on custom resource definitions. So the ability to configure it and not have, say, that hard-coded list where we had a flag, that's also going to be important. Because I don't want to necessarily stop Martin from doing that. I wouldn't say like, here's the set of things we can control with it.
Yeah, there's something we haven't discussed yet. Is it sufficient to just be able to block certain combinations of like actor, verb, object, namespace, or like suppose we do that and SIG auth comes to us next week and they're like, you know, we'd really like to limit some behavior from those actors, but not other behavior from those actors. I don't have an example off the top of my head, but if we're going to do a mechanism that revolves, or it's basically like RBAC, but for what you can write a webhook, right? Like something that is equivalent to that kind of permission system. I'd want to be very sure that that's going to be a like solution for forever, right? Like I don't want, and that we're not going to want to like have a subsequent problem where somebody wants to like, well, you can always make a change that sets this field, but this other field is really important, and I really want you to go through my webhook admission for if you're trying to change that field.
So
There's a hand for a while. Mo, do you want to? Is related to the current discussion, or you can hold until later?
Yeah, it was for this one. I was curious. Could you, if you really care about this particular problem, could you not configure your API server to have like an authentication, like a token review webhook, an authorization webhook, and then a externally hosted controller that goes in and very nicely in whatever policy that you want, configures all the webhooks on your cluster to not intercept things that they shouldn't intercept. And so this thing is not part of your dependency cycle. There's no way from the API to break its authn or authz because it's authorized and authenticated externally. And it can be driven by whatever policy you want to drive it by to course whatever configuration, right? And admission webhooks and validating webhooks cannot intercept other webhooks. Thus, there's no cycles. You can just not do that.
Yeah, that's another option. So my original proposal was more thinking of the way where you have server-defined policies configurations. Well, we have a separate policy that like applies client-side override. So I don't want like just mutate the server-side policy, but on the other hand, I want to override them. So to make it clear that we override the policy, but the original one is still there.
But does that actually make it clear? Like a user who puts their webhook in and doesn't have access to like the flags or whatever that API server is running with is going to think API server is broken because it's not like calling their webhook for everything that they've registered for.
Yeah. So from what I heard from what after heard what you guys said, I think it's more reasonable to expose this to as an API, not rather than a flag. So we can have like the API with like configuration override, and you have a list of objects that you want to override with a particular policy.
I think my sentiment on all of this is you're trying to find like a dependency circle that you have in your graph. And the way to do that is to not put the thing that fixes the circle in your cluster, put it not in the cluster, somewhere else, wherever that else is, right? And I know that's really annoying for like kubeADM clusters and any other self-hosted cluster because the whole point is everything is in the cluster. But I don't know if you can get out of this loop without actually getting out of the cluster, at least not perfectly.
I can say something. It's Martin. So I have plenty of experience with, let's say, problematic webhooks. And unfortunately, the way in which end users can break both the control plane and, for example, the workers is with webhooks is quite large. So and quite creative in some cases. And for some, what we have, for example, and we've seen it quite a while, is if you have, for example, multiple mutating webhooks with a timeout of like 5 or 10 seconds, but unfortunately, because the mutating webhooks are called sequentially, and if all of them time out, then like you end up in the same situation. So unfortunately, from my side, what we did was, okay, so here is a list of resources which always break both like the core controllers, and even the API server is broke, may not even start in some cases. Yeah, so what we normally do is we say, okay, here's the list of the webhooks, please fix them, and then yeah, just this is what we give to our end users as let's say as a feedback.
Yeah, I was thinking more like, I think, remember, gRPC has a server config where they define the timeout for each particular service. But when you make the gRPC call, you can also, I think we can override the timeout. So I was more thinking about that model where you can override, you can honor the default server-side config, but you can override when you actually make the call. Or
yeah, I like the point about how creative clients can be, and also I think the 10-second timeout is just far too long for mutating webhooks, and we should probably consider reducing that significantly.
It was 30 seconds originally.
Yeah.
Normally, yeah.
Yeah.
Then
you can get like 1.5 webhooks in the before you hit the global timeout.
And also one big problem is if you roll out, if you have those webhooks like from the start, then at some point they actually have right now 30 seconds because of the defaulting. So yeah, there is no way unless you override this value to change them. And we've actually tried to combat in some cases. Our first iteration was to write a controller which tries to overwrite, but then we end up in a situation when the end users, they also have a controller which overrides the webhook. So yeah, it's a moving battle.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's kind of a like, right? Like webhooks are not only can webhooks do something Turing complete on the input that you give them, but you don't even get to see what their code is, right? Like it's not even a case where you could statically analyze their code and see if it's going to break things, which in and of itself is an impossible problem, right? But we don't even have the code to analyze. So it kind of, it seems like there needs to be some sort of dynamic analysis of like, it's fine if we're getting isolated rejections from webhooks, but if all of a sudden a lot of things start failing at the same time, then maybe we need to like dynamically do something to address the situation. But I don't know what the something is.
I don't know that I would try to do something that smart. Like I would try to do something kind of dumb first.
I was just thinking about the read-only, no changes allowed webhook that someone put in to specifically block changes because they're doing something and they need to ensure that no changes are happening while it's happening, and then we override it. I think the other side, Dan, is like, it's the halting problem on one side, but it's the halting problem on our side because webhooks are allowing you to run arbitrary code arbitrarily. I didn't want to do webhooks. I agreed that they had value, and we chose the worst of all options because it was also probably, we chose the broadest option that was the most powerful because we knew that there was a whole class of problems. I still think webhooks are the wrong long-term, large-scale approach for this. There's certainly a class of a lot of admission plugins should probably be modeled as in-process plugins of some form. I'm not opening the door for discussion on that. Now I'm just saying, like,
actually I know I've mentioned this to David before, but I've been vaguely scheming in the background about, like, is there some way we could get people to compile their webhooks to WASM and run those in process?
And I think structurally long term, an ecosystem built on webhooks run by where people are providing webhooks provided to other people who then operate them in completely disparate environments is a recipe for failure. For most of the ecosystem, a better option is something that's more bounded and has more constraints. I don't really want to go back and bring back initializers.
Okay, I was going to say, this came in at the same time as initializers, and I am still not sold on initializers as the pattern that we want to do.
Well, initializers is just a different pattern. It's not trying to solve the webhook problem, which I think is, there's a bunch of valid problems that initializers can't solve. I'm not arguing to solve initializers. I'm merely saying webhooks are unacceptably bad in practice, but they can be made to work. Things that are bad in practice, but can be made to work are not usually sufficient from an engineering perspective. Like if a bridge can be made to work and most people don't die going across the bridge, that does not mean that is a good bridge.
You can get very far with something that's totally broken in theory, but actually works in practice, though.
Yeah, absolutely. But we know that webhooks are broken in practice for many people. And maybe what we're saying is the difference between 1% and 0.01% isn't going to come by adding increasing levels of complexity to webhooks.
Yeah, I can agree that. So I don't think we're ever going to get, like, no matter what clever solution we come up with, I think there's going to be webhooks in the system basically forever, because there's just some things that you need to call out to an external system, right? Like,
it's a foot gun. It's a valid foot gun.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we should remove webhooks. I'm saying for the majority of things that people are doing, can we deliver a better operational and more reliable approach?
I think if you're like statelessly twiddling some fields, a webhook is kind of a really clunky solution for that. But if you're like decrementing quota in some sort of cross-cluster environment or something like that, it's pretty legitimate to need a call out.
If you're performing conversion or are doing validation,
those can almost always be done in process.
Yeah, serializing that out to the wire and then sending it over to unreliable network in a system that's going from at most 3 nines, and then hoping that this all works is
yeah. And also the failure characteristics as you add additional webhooks are really bad, right?
Yeah, it scales with the number. The complexity scales with the number of webhooks super linearly. It may not be n squared, but certainly I fully expect at any point someone to go write the blog post, webhooks considered harmful, and they would be justified in doing it.
Yeah, maybe we should just, steal the time ahead of them. This doesn't really help. I agree with you, but it doesn't really help the immediate problem. And sadly, I don't think we have a good solution.
Yeah, I remember, David, you mentioned if it was up to you, you would prefer something dumb. Do you have like rough idea?
I would prefer. I'm open to having something done. I would prefer to describe who has the information and then who has the power to solve it, so that I could reason about what was there. I'm open to doing something with it, but just not what's described in the CAP. And I don't know offhand what that something is. I'm looking at it and I'm thinking there's probably some amount of entries in here that the deployer knows about, right? Like I think about me on OpenShift. I know a bunch of important things, and I probably know them better than a cluster admin. And then there's probably some pieces that a cluster admin knows better than I do. Oh, dumb, not done. Sorry. By dumb, I just meant something that I could look at and was not a dynamic thing. That was fairly static and easy to inspect. And then if later we develop something that has a way to twiddle that thing, it would be sort of one system built on top of a simpler system would be my preference for solving it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
David really likes the like two-step approach where we expose some knobs and then later build a system to twiddle the knobs if we need to. I could kind of do that, but I would like some sort of demonstration that such an automatic system could be written, right? Because I definitely have more clusters to keep working than I have. Like I definitely don't have the humans to go be twiddling knobs to keep clusters running. That's not going to work for me.
Yeah, I can see that. I also don't want to build a thing that's like, I wonder why I did that. I don't know. Who should we ask? I like to be able to look and say it did that because of this, and
Yeah.
then I can look and say, okay, the automatic system set that value to the wrong thing.
Yeah, and I also think like the security folks who are writing these policies, sometimes they genuinely would prefer for the cluster to fail and stop working completely than to have their security policy violated, right? So I don't know. I don't have a good sense for like how common that is, but I think some people like this is working as intended for some people, and they're happy with this.
Often it'll be something like a pod security boundary, where if you
Yeah.
admit a pod to a spot you didn't expect, well, now I just have to burn that node down. So by letting that pod in, I had to burn a node. That was not net good.
So I think maybe there's a completely alternative line of approach where so the cases that we actually want to catch are where the webhook is breaking the cluster for a reason unintended by the author. And so I wonder if a like trial period, or like you turn it on and like for 24 hours it can't fail closed, or something like that, right? So you get some sort of sense of, is this thing gonna reject things that I didn't expect it to reject? Even that has some issues because like we mentioned, there's like timing, and you can be slow even if you don't fail, and that's enough to break things.
I got to say on that, Daniel, like we've seen a lot of cases of when you're in the steady state and you've turned on the policy, everything is fine, and it's only the policy only hits you when you do something like upgrade or restart a node or whatever unusual operation.
Yeah. Maybe there's like something else, like the first 5 fails we respect, and then if that happens in too short of a time period, then maybe we change it to fail open or something. But then the security people wouldn't like that. So
yeah, I was going to ask, generally with something like a webhook dependency, if you're making an inline call out that you can fail on, you'd say, I want my dependency to have an order of magnitude more reliability or uptime than mine. Like my SLOs from my dependencies need to be higher than what I can provide because things fail independently. Do we in any way provide the right perception, measurement, and mental model that would allow people to reason about that? Like when someone uses a webhook, are they thinking about, yep, this webhook needs to be more reliable than the kube cluster I'm putting it on, or it needs to have that characteristic? And maybe like some of what we're talking about here, Daniel, like you're implicitly looking at policies that are the trade-offs between a 0.99, like if your webhook is reliable, you can tolerate some failures in the worst case. If you did not know your operator is not reliable and you put it in, the worst possible case will almost certainly exacerbate that and bring down your cluster. So is there a way for us to separate the two classes of webhook and the two expectations that an end user would have into reasonable boundaries?
Yeah, there's so many different kinds of failure that you can have. You're displaying some chat there, Fede. There's so many kinds of failure that a webhook can have, right? Like you could have a bug in your policy that is rejecting things deterministically that it shouldn't reject. You could be slow. There could be a network disconnection, and like the random things that you don't have a deterministic bug about could come and go, or they could be pretty permanent. yeah, I don't know. I mean, so there's if our primary problem with webhooks is that they're occasionally flaky, we could actually measure that from API server by just sending them a bunch of extra requests and see like how flaky they are, and if they are too flaky, we could set a status or something and disable them. But I think that is, you know, if the problem is that you intercepted leases when you shouldn't have, testing you for flakiness is not really the appropriate way to solve that.
Yeah, flakiness, I would expect the problem to be more like I cannot rebootstrap myself after I'm turned on. So like when the entire cluster turns off and turns back on, it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's another problem. Like how many people have actually tested whether their cluster can cold boot?
We normally have option for let's say hibernate, or like just scale down the control plane and get rid of the workers. And in some cases, it's even worse with webhooks, because the webhooks can actually act on resources which are responsible for creating the webhook, such as deployment spots and everything. And so the webhook, which is, for example, for all pods inside of the cluster, cannot be applied because the webhook itself cannot start.
Yeah, so I experienced this with a networking one that needed to create a deployment that set an owner reference to a value so that the GC admission plugin couldn't do discovery to match the resource, so that when that happened, it could not recreate its pod to boot. So like these things fail in difficult to predict ways. You know, who would even know that that was a thing, and how would you prevent it from happening? Like in that case, it seems to me that that's more like a problem for the admission webhook author to solve than for either the cluster admin or the you know, deployer.
Yeah, that kind of thing is exactly why I'm not a big fan of a list of forbidden things or combinations that the API server won't actually call the webhook for. It's just because it's so reactive and there's so many strange things that could break, right? Like how is an admin, how could they possibly predict in advance that failure mode, right? I guess it's kind of great that you could maybe forbid it after you know about it, but that doesn't get you uptime, right? It's still
Well,
like
it gets you uptime. It gets you uptime a month from that after everything's been redeployed on the other 10,000 clusters.
Right, but it doesn't. Like the key piece of work that it doesn't save you is figuring out what happened, right? You still have to know. You still have to understand what went wrong well enough to like know that a particular thing should have been forbidden. Yeah. So in that sense, it's reactive, and I think, I mean, I guess, yeah, I don't know. Every failure class is its own special snowflake, right? Like, because if you like, even if you encounter an unknown failure mode, you're going to do something to fix it. Whether we provide this functionality or if you just start monitoring what webhooks are acting against, you're going to fix it some way. So it's probably not going to happen again, or there's a good reduced chance that it'll happen again, which means that the next thing that hits you will be something else. Like a mechanism where like every time you have a problem, you have to figure it out and put in yet another rule forbidding it. I don't know. I'm not a fan of the approach.
Okay, I guess like with today's mechanisms, if a class administrator really hate fair close policy, for example, the best way they can do is to have a validating webhook that reject other webhooks if they have a fail close policy or very long timeout.
Yeah, except you're not allowed to put in webhooks that hook webhooks. To at least the intention behind that rule was to make it impossible to add a webhook that just breaks your cluster, because then you can't remove it. So
Yeah, we've had experience with this. If you write that webhook, you are now mucking with etcd bits on disk to fix your cluster. It's not fun.
yeah, if you break out etcd control to like unbrick your cluster, you're having a bad day. I guess my my initial thought is on what to do practically speaking right now is to somehow restrict things by namespace, so users write webhooks against their namespaces that they have permissions on, and not on like kube system or namespaces that run critical things.
And so this would be in addition to the namespace selector we already have? Or would it just be something that programs the namespace selector? I think that was Mo's point. Like, if you want this, you can program the namespace selector.
Yeah, I honestly, I cannot keep track of what we implemented in the namespace selector versus what we talked about implementing the namespace selector. So I'm not sure if you can do this without changes right now.
Because you have a not in, you can label namespaces and then exclude them.
Yeah, no, I know you can set up a webhook that does the right thing, but I'm not sure if you can force users to only do webhooks that don't monkey with your namespaces.
With that,
I have a suggestion. Why does Kubernetes itself mark like the kube system, the not leases, and I think with kube public as well, namespaces which it actually handles with some label?
We weren't interested in preventing, so the content that gets put there, we know of people who add additional content in there. They run their own thing in kube system, right? And who's to say it should not be restricted as a, for instance?
Yeah, I have an even worse answer, which is that namespaces were only about visibility in the early days, and they weren't really a security boundary at all. And they've kind of sort of grown into one. Yeah.
would it be an option? I don't know how that would be possible right now, but if you allow a user to create webhooks, they can mess with anybody's namespace through that. If we could allow the admin to say, you are allowed to create webhooks, but they are only allowed to act in this namespace in the configuration, then users can only mess with their own namespaces by our back definition.
I mean, adding a webhook is a super privileged operation.
It's not enforcing an invariant on types in a cluster, right? So saying like you can have a webhook in your namespace is kind of unusual.
I mean, maybe we should consider like having a some sort of escalating level of like this kind of webhook. Webhooks at tier 3 can see particular namespaces. Webhooks at tier 2 can see groups of namespaces, operate on groups of namespaces, and webhooks at tier 1 can operate on the whole, can enforce invariance on the whole cluster. I mean,
it wouldn't have to be. Sorry. What I thought about was more like a field selector for permissions. So you can create a webhook, but it has to have this namespace in its namespaces field. Kind of.
Yeah, that might be an implementation
idea, but
mechanism. But just the properties of having some webhooks act on subsets of the cluster. I mean, like, what do you do when webhooks at different tiers have different opinions about what is valid? I mean,
Yeah.
I guess it would be like, basically, if they can't agree on a valid thing, then you can't do anything. Like that, people in that namespace can't do anything, which maybe is okay. It seems a little hard to debug and figure out.
Is that really a new problem though, Daniel? I mean, if you have multiple webhooks today that disagree on what's valid, you're going to have the same problem.
It is, yeah, you definitely have the same problem. And today it breaks the whole cluster, so you'll find out right away. But if we go to a system where it's like less privileged to add a webhook because you can make it operate on a tiny subset of the cluster, then it seems like you would hit that with more frequency. Like, right, like especially this kind of implies that you've got webhooks from completely different sources, right? Like the cluster operator cares about some things, and the namespace, like
I don't know how practical that is in terms of like people both having those, caring about them, wanting them to run. Like, if they're already looking and saying, you know what, I can do my job looking at a subset of namespaces, they have the ability to do that today, and they aren't the ones you're having trouble with today. So like you've built a mechanism to protect yourself from the ones that you should never have had applied to you to begin with, and there's already a mechanism to not have them apply to you. So it seems a little weird.
All right. I think we've had a good discussion of all the things that, all the various ways to not solve the problem. I don't know if I have a productive suggestion for getting our way out of this. So maybe we can leave it here and everybody can think about it. And if anybody has ideas, send them to the mailing list.
So I do want to mention the one non-coding idea I put in the comments, which is that I think a best practices doc with some templates on how to do things like not affect kube system can help. And it takes no coding to do it.
If we were going to do that, I think I'd be more interested in trying to assign a label to it where you can describe things like namespaces with this label are essential for getting a Kube API server, controller manager, and scheduler running. Namespaces with this label are essential for making sure your authentication and authorization stack work. That's how we segregated it in OpenShift so that we were able to do it. I think it was pretty successful, and it wouldn't be then opinionated and on where people stuff their stuff.
Yeah.
Again,
I think some of our examples even have stuff like
David.
Sorry.
I was gonna say, I'm not disagreeing with you, David. I just think that that's exactly the sort of thing that goes into a best practices doc, right?
Fair.
Yeah, I think best practices documents are for things that you haven't figured out how to solve in code yet.
Wouldn't the cluster admin be able to change the namespace labels?
The idea of some of these namespace labels is that a deployer would help set them, right? And then if the label was consistent, then a webhook author could rely on it and say, I want to enforce something on config maps that are not in ring 1.
Yeah, I think our existing documents have stuff like ring 1, ring 2.
Yeah, they do.
And also, I think the idea is whoever has power to set these labels is also interested in the cluster continuing to run, so that they won't do something that stops. There's also a KEP and some code coming this upcoming release, I believe, that's going to begin setting a label with the namespace name, which is somewhat related, and you wouldn't be able to change that label. Yeah, okay. Fede, do you want to make us all depressed about the code freeze date?
Yes, I remember that is coming. And I think it's important, especially for people that will have to be reviewing and approving pull requests, to make sure you create some buffer, because I know a couple of big ones coming. Server-side apply is one of them. So yeah, just wanted to remind the SIG, and also especially for people on the owner's file, you're going to be busy. So hope we can pass this one. Yeah, and that is the only thing I had.
All right. Well,
Good.
good luck, everybody, thinking of ways to improve the webhook system. Let us know if you think of anything.
Just one thing
Yeah.
from my side. Because I have a very substantial list of things which break at least like the core components of Kubernetes. So do you want me to make it in proper document and add it? I don't know, to the admission page, or what would be
Yeah, that sounds great.
Having read that, there are many that I disagree with.
Yeah.
Like, so, like the majority, yeah, I'm okay in principle, but like the majority of that list,
yes. What of them are specific for our use case, but I would just get rid of everything that's not breaking, like kube controller manager, kube scheduler, and etc.
I also think it would be awesome to have a discussion about why something is or is not breaking the cluster on the mailing list. So that might be a good place to start.
Okay.
Sounds great. I will upload the recording later today, tomorrow, and I will post it in the channel and here in the notes. I want to thank everybody for their brains and passion and participation. I hope everybody stays safe, and we'll see you next time. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.